Okay, well, it is noon, and so I'm going to start right on time today because we have a full hour planned and we're hoping to have some questions and answers at the end. So, welcome everyone to the Reconnecting the Rockies webinar. Thank you so much for joining us today. We were actually really thrilled by the turnout when we sent out this webinar and are excited to share some of our preliminary findings with you today. We plan to provide you with an overview of the Reconnecting the Rockies science program, which is focused on monitoring and understanding how wildlife interact with the road mitigation system that is being installed by Alberta Transportation and Economic Corridors along Highway 3 in southwestern Alberta and the Canadian Rockies. So I'd like to begin today's webinar by acknowledging that we are gathering on Treaty 7, which is the ancestral and traditional lands of the Blackfoot Confederacy, which is comprised of Siksika, Kainai, and Piikani First Nations, the Yahi Nakota, including Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney First Nations, as well as Tsuut'ina First Nations, and the Calgary Elbow Métis District within the Battle River Territory. I'd also like to take a moment today to introduce the science team for Reconnecting the Rockies Alberta, and I'm going to highlight the two speakers for today. So actually, when I mention your name, if you can just turn your camera on and wave if that's possible so people can see who you are, that'd be great. So I'll start off by introducing Maria Didowsky, who's a senior wildlife biologist at Alberta Environment and Protected Areas. And Maria will be speaking today. Her link will be posted in the bio shortly. And she will be talking kind of about what we're trying to achieve with our project today. Then we also have two wildlife biologists from Alberta Environment and Protected Areas, Erin Miller and Peter White. We have Dr. Clayton Lamb, who's our principal researcher for Reconnecting the Rockies Alberta, and he's with the Wildlife Service Center Biodiversity Pathways out of UBC, the University of British Columbia. And Clayton will also be presenting today, so his bio will also be posted in the chat. And he will be presenting on what movement data can tell us about how large mammals are moving around the landscape and crossing Highway 3. Just a caveat that this is preliminary. We haven't even had data for a year, so I'm just excited to share what we're planning to do today. Emily Bryn is a natural area manager with the Nature Conservancy of Canada. Today, she will be managing the questions at the end. So if you have questions, there's quite a few of us today. Could you please put them in the chat as we're going along, and Emily will be reciting those at the end for Maria and Clayton. We have Nicole Cahal. She's a conservation analyst at the Miistakis Institute. And then myself, Tracy Lee, I'm Director of Conservation and Research at Miistakis. So welcome today. Before Maria begins with her presentation, we just would like to acknowledge our very generous funders. We really appreciate your support. Some of you on this list have been supporting conservation and Miistakis and many of our partners for over 2 decades, and we're really happy to have you here today and share with you what we've achieved. And while Maria gets ready for her presentation, I just want to acknowledge that Maria usually includes an amazing slide that outlines the number of individuals that have helped make this project happen. It is an astounding list. And I just want to give a shout out to all the conservation officers that contributed to the grizzly bear collaring from the Justice and Solicitor General Ministry of Alberta, Banff National Park and Waterton Lakes National Park staff that have provided resources, and all the private landowners that have provided access and permission to their land to either trap, collar, or put up remote cameras. We thank you so much. Couldn't do this without you all. So without further ado, Maria, please take it away.
Can you see it okay and hear me okay?
We can hear you great, and we can see well.
Awesome. Perfect. Well, thank you for the opportunity to come and share with the group. During our capture work, I'd like to tell a little bit about our team. And we often, when we're out catching bears or elk, or when one of us makes a mistake and one of our team members helps the other one out, we tease each other that it really takes a community to get the work done. And I have to say, it really does. And I'm really honored to be part of this community and the community that's working on this project. And I'm thankful for the support and the funding that's been so generously donated to make safety a priority for both people and wildlife in these mountain towns. So today I'm going to share sort of like the fundamental pieces of Reconnecting the Rockies, how it got started and why, and how we captured wildlife, because that's kind of the fun piece, and seeing nice pictures of animals, and then sort of how it would apply to wildlife mitigation measures along Highway 3. So wildlife generally live a pretty difficult existence. They face a lot of risks in their life, like predation and weather. And if anybody lives down here in the Southwest, wind. And they're able to survive through those conditions. And they can cross a lot of obstacles and barriers like rivers and mountains, arid grasslands, snowy passes in their everyday lives. And highways just add risk to that already risky lifestyle where mortality is often the result when they try to cross. Some locations along the highway, they can see oncoming traffic and they can kind of plan to cross safely. And sometimes they try to cross really quickly and then they get hit. And when highways get really busy, there's some species that just stop trying to cross altogether because that risk is too high. And so in order for the government to make changes to highways to make them safer, they use a database decision-making process, and they use several different reporting mechanisms to determine where those high-risk zones are. And for us in Alberta, we're really lucky that Transportation and Economic Corridors Ministry has developed a program called Wildlife Watch, which is like an app that when people are picking up roadside mortalities along the highway, they log a GPS location where each animal is picked up. And so this goes into the program, and the program can then determine where, these animals are being hit on the highway. And this doesn't necessarily incorporate, like wildlife die right on the highway, but some wildlife, will get hit and move further off the highway and die outside of that road allowance where animals would be picked up along the highway. And so, Miistakis has in the past shown that there's an even greater abundance of animals, that up to 3 times as many as what is found along the highway that dies off the highway as well. And so this is some of the data from our study area. You can see kind of time of year when these mortalities are happening. And then you can kind of see what species are also being hit along the highways. And obviously the deer is pretty astronomical. How many, that's just from the road allowance piece, that are yearly dying along this stretch of highway. So basically our study area is that big red blob in the bottom left-hand corner there. And it helps us prioritize that mitigation measures need to be developed within that area. And so this data actually is online. So if you want to check it out, please do. I think there'll be a link posted in the chat later for everyone. So if you want to take a look at some of the details or pick a different study area, you can. So then this wildlife mortality data is then combined with other reporting mechanisms like police reports, insurance claims. So because there's a cost to this with every highway strike, whether it's just the maintenance of picking up the animal or the damage to highway structures or to the vehicles and the cost of insurance claims for the vehicles or people's injuries. And then there's the ecological costs as well. And so in southern Alberta, the Reconnecting the Rockies Alberta project is really highlighting these hundreds of animals, and not as, this is tragic for both people and wildlife that are trying to pass through this corridor. And we know, like from past research, that highway structures along with exclusion fencing is really proven to be the most effective mitigation measure for reducing mortality along the highways. And in order for us to construct one in Alberta, the cost of building that structure has to be less than the costs associated with the vehicle strikes within that space. So if you have like fencing from A to B, if you add up those costs, so that cost to fix all the damages would be greater than what it would cost to build that structure. So then it's a net benefit to Albertans, and that's how we get approval for those types of projects. Hopefully that makes sense. So to date, I guess, our wildlife crossing structures in Alberta have mostly been planned in relatively undisturbed landscapes. So most people, I think, on this call have probably driven if they're from Alberta or have been to Alberta, have driven to Banff, and they have seen some of these crossing structures. And they basically are in contiguous federally owned lands, undisturbed landscape, and the structure crosses the main disturbance piece, which is the highway. And the same concept exists for our most recent Peter Lougheed wildlife crossing structure in the Bow Valley. If anybody has seen it, that's in this is a picture of it, which also is relatively undisturbed crown lands. And these structures have been placed, in pristine habitat. There's a lot of flexibility of where that goes along the highway because there's, not other barriers to where that structure goes. But when you look at the landscape that we're working in and reconnecting the Rockies, there's developed communities and there's more challenges into where you can even place one of these, let alone what wildlife species are there. So I think in principle, we support, safety of people and wildlife. And we're also really fortunate to have really healthy, active communities in the Crow's Nest Pass where people want to be on the landscape, biking and hiking and climbing and canoeing and fishing and riding their horses and, hunting or whatever those things might be. And then you combine this with the other types of use of the land, which is, agriculture or ranching, industrial, forestry, we have mining. And then there's this challenge of how to fit that connectivity into, a fairly disturbed landscape and find a spot that matches both where wildlife want to cross with, the protection of the land. So there's connectivity, it won't be developed. And, it becomes more difficult on how to place those on the landscape. And then on top of all this, the site has to be appropriate for like actually building something. So, you can't build an underpass where there's a river or, who knew that we have lava rock in southern Alberta that you can't actually drill into. So, there's all these other challenges that come up with like, how do you place a structure on the landscape? And then we also have like multiple linear features. So we have the highway, we have the railway, we have the river system, and we also have a lot of different species that, try to move over big distances, whether that's, grizzly bears or black bears or elk or deer, moose, all of our charismatic megafauna, wolves, cougar, wolverine. And we even have bighorn sheep and mountain goats here too that need structures to cross the highway. And so when we're looking at priority sites and looking at all the different types of crossing structures, we also try to consider the, the smaller things that might, need a culvert, like a salamander or a snake. And so consider all of the needs of all the species that might need to be crossing the highway. So, and for us to identify priority locations, we have a variety of historical information that we have used to come up with these. And so we have, a lot of support from, our NGOs, camera projects, landowner knowledge that we've heard from people and, FWMS data. We have GPS data from other projects, like on the bighorn sheep. We've been given some collar data from Wild Sheep Foundation. And so we have ways of compiling all of the data that we do have on the landscape and to like highlight where these priority areas are. In this example, you can see in the left-hand picture there that there's like two mountain ranges and sheep are in two different populations. They don't really cross in between and they both cross the highway. And so they, their habitat or their home ranges are on either side of the highway. So they, if we were to fence off the whole thing and not have structures, that would be a huge impact to these populations. And so they need to be considered. And then when we zoom in on those data points on the upper right-hand side, we can see that there's, a variety of spots that the sheep might cross. So it might give you kind of a more particular area within that where a structure should be designed or could be designed, I guess. And then we have supporting camera data that can show us like, maybe there's other species that are crossing there too. So black bear or moose or whatever that might be. So we identify all of these locations along the highway. So this is another website that you guys can access. It's publicly facing. This is from the Wildlife Watch, where the mortality data is as well, but also this is where the mitigation projects are. And you can see over the whole province where these are planned. So Alberta Transportation and Economic Corridors has posted this using the data that we have on wildlife movement and mortality. We've identified these structure sites, like crossing structures. So those are the Cs on there. The Rs on there are retrofits, so things that could be improved, but maybe not have as high of an investment. These, of course, aren't the only sites that wildlife cross, but these are sort of identified as those like key spots that if we lost it, that you might actually have like population level effects. And of course, all of these sites have to have that net benefit if you're going to do work at these sites in order to make sure that it's valuable for Albertans. So we have two types of data that we're collecting in our project. The first one is cameras. So we have wildlife cameras, and they're situated at each of those priority zones. So if you go back, to that other picture that I showed you of all those locations, we have 4 cameras at each of those sites at least. And so we have 2 that are right on the highway. So one on the north and one on the south side, or one on the east side or west side, depending on what, that structure looks like there, whether it's a river. And so at each of these priority locations, we have those 2 that are right on the highway to see what's crossing. So whether it's under a bridge or through a culvert, or maybe it's just across the highway where we might build a structure. And then there's 2 cameras that are placed further away to catch, some animals might not come all the way to the highway, or we might get some animals that bump off. That barrier effect is really hard to capture with camera data. So then we also have other data that we're collecting that I'll share later. So that's kind of how it's structured. So we have over 100 cameras, or about 100 cameras out there on the landscape right now. And this is kind of what they look like. There's ones on the left. There's one on a trail that we're setting up. So that's further away from the highway. And then we have one like on the right-hand picture there, which is one of the cameras mounted under one of our bridges, where we would like to do one of those retrofits. And so they catch both a daily picture, so we know that the camera is still operating, and then we catch any movement of wildlife. Sometimes we also catch movement of like the river or the grass in front, and we get, 20,000 pictures of things that we can't use. And then if we catch pictures of people, we have automatically like a blurring thing, so that we don't actually catch who or what's going through there, so that we can clean those photos out, because really this is wildlife centric. Then we have the collaring piece. So we use GPS collars on all of the species that we are interested in here, which is elk, mule deer, and grizzly bears. So for the elk and deer captures, we have focused so far on helicopter captures. And this limits the collar deployment really to open areas where the nets can be used. And so we're hoping for our future captures this winter, we're going to try some ground captures around like towns or in more closed habitats, so that we can get a better variety of across the entire range. And then these collars capture locations every 2 hours. They're designed to blow off or fall off by the time that the battery expires, which, sometimes happens, sometimes doesn't. Most of the time it does nowadays. And so, yeah, this is our first year of this collar work, and Clayton's going to share some of that cool stuff with you guys in a couple of minutes. And then on the other side of things, the grizzly bear piece, collaring bears is a lot more difficult than just collaring elk or deer with a helicopter capture. It's a bit more time consuming. A little more spicy sometimes, I guess, in some respects, but generally pretty amazing how well it went this season, because of the support we had from like landowners and leaseholders and FWS in this work. So we basically pick up the roadkill that's happening all year round, but we, pick it up from the beginning of the trapping season. We set up cameras. We create these bait sites where we know bears come to, and then we can see from the camera information when the bears come out of the den. So this big guy here, he's come out of his den and found our lovely treats that we left for him. And so then we can, once we know that a bear has come out and is visiting a site predictably, then we can set up our traps. And these cameras also give us a lot of really great information about what we know is going to be at the trap site. So at this location in particular, we had a sow come with 3 cubs. We knew she had multiples there, so we brought out more than one trap, so that if, by chance we caught a cub first, then we wouldn't come there and just have a cub in a trap and then have to deal with mom outside the trap. So we set up 2, and cub got caught first. And then the mom, of course, went in the other trap to try to get close and caught her as well. So then, less spicy scenario that we have to deal with is having the little guys on the outside. Um, and yeah, so then we can know what we're coming into for handling. Bears are drugged in the trap. They're removed from the trap. We take biological measurements, like DNA, temperature, how they're doing on the drugs, breathing, fat content, blood, pit tags, age them as best we can. And then most importantly, we put on a GPS collar. And then once we have that on and secured, then bears are reversed. We try to put them back in the trap so that it's safest for them to wake up in the trap and they don't, run into things, and then we release them. So hopefully this works for everyone. This is one of our little releasing videos. So this is from one of our bears being let go after they've woken up. And then they're set free to go collect all the data that's going to make this project function. And then, yeah, basically we use the camera data and the collar data to learn about how wildlife is moving on the landscape before structures happen. And then as these get developed, we'll learn more about, what their needs are for placement and design, even up to the vegetation that's put and where it's put on these structures is really important. And yeah, the data is not only going to benefit us and our community for like people safety and wildlife safety, but this research is also going to really provide a lot of information for other places within Alberta or around the world that are facing the same connectivity challenges. So with that, I'm going to let Clayton show some of his cool stuff and enjoy his presentation. Thanks for having me.
We can see your screen, Clayton, but we can't hear you yet.
Wow, sorry, my unmute was
Gotcha.
across three screens and it was just absolute chaos. That was a very long pause in my world.
Okay, we've got you.
Okay, stand by. Like the Zoom screen keeps disappearing. One sec. Share my screen.
We can see your slide now.
Good. Okay, let's go. Thanks everybody. So this would kind of be affectionately what Maria would probably call the nerdy part of the presentation. So I just kind of want to do a high level overview of collision reduction systems elsewhere across the world, actually, and especially Western North America. Just talk about the importance of the Canadian Rockies, which will probably be no surprise to everybody on this call, but I like to just talk about how special this place is that we get to work and live in. Kind of go over some of the fine details of the infrastructure that's going to be built in the Reconnecting the Rockies project and some of the lingering ecological and kind of logistical and infrastructure-based questions, and then talk about the effectiveness monitoring, both on the Alberta side, sort of some early results on that, and then kind of maybe a bit of a peek into what it might look like on the Alberta side using what we're learning on the BC side. So, folks may or may not be familiar with how many crossing systems there actually are across the globe. I mean, we're all pretty familiar with Banff, and it is sometimes in our day-to-day. You see it pop up on Facebook across the world as well. It's a world-class system. But there's also all of these other systems. So these are as far as what we could map for overpasses across the globe. And they're in many, many countries, and there's actually even hundreds of them in Europe and all across the world. And again, these are just overpasses, but amongst all these are underpasses and fencing and big collision reduction systems. In the west here, Banff is at the top of the screen there, but British Columbia has a few crossing structures as well, and then all the way down into the States. There's quite a few overpasses all through the kind of rocky chain. And, today we're going to focus in this area, somewhere that's probably close to many of our hearts. And it is sort of a gap in this, this chain of trying to keep these places connected. Looking at some of the other systems, again, folks would know that Banff has been quite a big success. It's pretty positive and large, substantial collision reductions, but there's also, this has been replicated really elsewhere. So in Colorado, Wyoming, Arizona, and there's a new one in Washington, and we're seeing reduction in large mammal collisions, often exceeding 80%, and sometimes up to 89, 93%. And so these are pretty dramatic changes for both wildlife and for motorists going, seeing an order of magnitude reduction in collisions due to these systems. So incredibly effective. And they're also sort of an art, I would say, in that people are making them different in different places, and there's no really one textbook on how to do it. And so there's a lot to learn on how to do it, say, more optimally, and from adjacent areas. And then thinking about sort of the biodiversity or the assemblage of large mammals, this is a map of the assemblage of large mammals across North America right now. So on the left is the distribution of large mammals, and the more red, the more there are. And that kind of BC and Western Alberta section is this sort of hotspot of large mammal occurrence. And then the right is the change from the past. You'll see that really there hasn't changed a ton in that kind of core BC and Alberta mountain zone. And so our focal area here, and somewhere that lots of us call home, is really this kind of internationally significant hotspot of large mammal density and occurrence, and why a lot of these systems are really important to keep animals moving as this place gets busier and more developed in some ways. And zooming in, the Rockies are a big mountain range. And I mean, folks, when you're hiking them, just getting over one mountain is a big endeavor. And when you drive the highway, it seems like a long time, but in reality, at the big scale, there's a bit of a pinch point, a kind of a narrowing of the Rocky Mountains right around where Highway 3 crosses. And it's really only about 70 kilometers wide. This kind of major north-south corridor actually isn't that wide. And it gets a lot wider as you go north and south, but there's this little sort of waste here where, to the east, it's pretty developed by agriculture, and to the west, same thing. The Rocky Mountain Trench is pretty habitated by people. And so we kind of have this one little spot where animals can get through, and within here, it also can be busy. So this is just sort of a very crude measure of a human influence index. And so you can see those mountain and that corridor is generally pretty intact, but we have these sort of slices through it where Fernie, Elkford, Sparwood, the highway, the Crow's Nest Pass communities, and then Highway 1 up in the top. We kind of see this bisecting of the Rockies here. And so this is kind of why the Highway 1 system came to be, and this is why the Highway 3 system has come to be as well. And so this is sort of the high-level map of the Reconnecting the Rockies project. It's kind of amazing that it came together across 2 provinces, and the animals don't see those borders, obviously, and neither do the motorists. We cross them freely, and so it's pretty incredible to see the British Columbia Ministry of Transportation and Alberta Transportation and Economic Corridors really commit to these systems and build a pretty amazing world-class connectivity system. And this is a map of what it will potentially look like. There's going to be some small changes, like the structure type might change as engineers look deeper at it and the locations. But overall, this is kind of the project extent. And you'll see some things have already been done on the BC side. And this is actually an older map in that it says Rock Creek and the fencing is still in construction. And really, it's almost done now at this point. And so we'll probably be updating this map in real time as this project proceeds. But it's about a 75-kilometer chunk of the highway that will be safer for people and wildlife as a result. And so anybody that lives down here or travels down here has probably seen Rock Creek advance through the last few months. And, this is an exciting picture shared by the Alberta Transportation Economic Corridor showing Rock Creek is finished. And so there's vehicles going over it. You might not even notice it now, but the animals definitely do. The fencing is just getting finished. And so the system is proceeding in real time. On the BC side, this is kind of what some of those retrofitted structures will look like in Alberta, or could potentially. This is an example of retrofitting an existing structure. So a before on the left-hand side, riprap basically right to the creek. This is Alexander Creek, just as you enter BC. And then on the right is a retrofitted structure where kind of move that riprap a little bit inward, build a path, and put some pea gravel down. And now there's a trail for animals. Fencing going up on the BC side, folks may have seen this. I didn't get a picture on the Alberta side because it just is happening right now, but you're seeing fencing going up on both sides. And this is sort of the heart of the system, right? Like if you just build the crossing structures, you wouldn't get that much of a collision reduction. You would probably just still have animals crossing. And so it's kind of the fencing plus the crossing structures that really create the part of the system. Jump outs in case animals get in, especially while we're building the system where there's open fence ends that aren't too far from each other. And so, really, I think at the high level, there's really an immense opportunity here, definitely for science to kind of learn how to do this better, but also just to, on a conservation side, to look after these animals and look after motorists that are moving around these pretty important landscapes. And on the science side, kind of as Maria mentioned, we've deployed, GPS collars before this system was developed. Remote cameras are going up. And then we're going to kind of enter into this post-construction monitoring phase where there'll be some adaptive management. It's pretty common in these systems that there's some kind of figuring out and patching of little hiccups, whether there's animals getting into the fence in some spots or they don't want to cross in some areas. And so there's kind of going to be an adaptive phase where you increase effectiveness and then try to look at, what we can learn from how this was built to, inform future projects like structure design, how to make jump outs better, all the things that we can learn. And really, it's just such a unique opportunity because of the wealth of historic data. There's hundreds of animals that have been collared in this area before on the BC and Alberta side, and just a really great suite of partners working on it. So some of the things that we're working with on the kind of before and after monitoring and the effectiveness monitoring side of this is crossing rates before and after. So, these animals are collared and they're moving around the landscape without any fencing. Where are they crossing? And then we'll see how and where they cross after. Migration corridor, some of these animals have massive migrations. They will sometimes go 50, 100 kilometers away from their winter ranges. We want to make sure that highway still allows that and maybe even facilitates more of that. Behavior around the fence, just how the fence changes things, home range sizes, of course, road kill rates, predator-prey dynamics, just making sure that the fencing and the underpasses and the overpasses don't change that. And then again, trying to optimize that structure design. These are very expensive structures. We want to make sure they work as well for animals and also try to see if there's ways to keep them working well and reduce costs, which is kind of the holy grail of these very expensive systems. And I mean, they're expensive, at least in conservation dollars with the small numbers that we tend to work with. But, as Maria said, they make good economic sense given the cost of the collisions. Okay, I'm going to play you a little animation here. It kind of has a lot of names. It's what it is the animals that we collared in 2025 moving around the landscape, but it's been called our ant farm as well. And also anxiety spaghetti. So you'll see what we mean when we play it. So these are sort of the 2025 collared animals, collared by species. And it's just sort of a month in the life to give you an idea of what these data look like. And, so we're seeing them move around this landscape, cross the highway at times, but also avoid the highway. And this is sort of information that's going to form that foundation of that before and after monitoring from the collar side. just sort of zoom in on a couple individuals. So these are 2 elk that we collared in that Sentinel area. Maybe one of the ones in the photo that Maria sent when in that open field. And, these animals, one, they kind of embody the Reconnecting the Rockies project in that they winter in Alberta. There's a herd of elk that winters in that Sentinel range and then summers in BC in the Corbin drainage. And so they are cross-province. They need to cross the highway to conduct their migration, and they are migratory. So these are the kind of animals that we really want to look after as a result of this project. And one thing that's kind of cool is where they're crossing is actually now fenced on the BC side. And so we are now sort of having this cross program or cross jurisdiction impacts on these animals. And they are actually starting to use these underpasses. And so we had a bunch of collar data from the BC side, actually, where animals were doing this migration and they were crossing in these areas, and we built an underpass, we fenced it, and now these new animals that we just collared in Alberta are doing the same migration, but using the underpass. And I'll show you this exact individual crossing under the underpass. So there's gonna be 3 elk, and the last one has a collar. And there she goes, and it's funny. It's like seeing an old friend, because we caught that elk, and I was there and we helped put that collar on, and then you see her on your camera a couple months later, and so kind of cool to see them, and we have multiple scales of data coming in, so here she is, crossing through. I guess another thing is this is not an uncommon sight, say in Banff, or in Kootenay National Park, where you drive along the highway and you see a grizzly bear. Sometimes like a whole jam of people looking at a grizzly bear, and it's odd, or it's at least noticeable that you basically never see that on Highway 3. I've lived in the Elk Valley on the BC side for almost a decade, and I think one of the only bears I saw was at 3 in the morning driving home from the airport, and I've collared 100 grizzly bears here, so I know there's a whole bunch, but I never see them. And that's the case here. We do see them sometimes, but not that often. And so looking at the crossing data from the collars, we can see why. So the gray bars are the frequency of when animals cross the highway. So the more gray bars, the more crossings. And, they basically only cross at night. So this is kind of this hot off the press new grizzly bear data that we have for Southwest Alberta. And yeah, they're crossing at night, which is why we don't see them unless you're driving home from the airport at 3 in the morning. But they are crossing, which is also kind of cool. So just some early results of sort of where we're heading here. This is for the folks that are super nerdy, an integrated step selection analysis looking at grizzly bear connectivity and crossing in this area. And so there's a whole bunch of things that we looked at, but just generally trying to get at this: where are bears crossing, why are they crossing, and all the things that basically influence their distribution in this landscape. So distance to the highway, towns, quality of the food nearby, croplands, topography, traffic, just all the inputs that these bears have to sort of juggle as they navigate a pretty challenging landscape. And so some of the early results of this are telling us that the avoidance of the highway is still pretty strong for these grizzly bears. We do have, a few dozen crossings already, but compared to if the highway wasn't there, the bears are basically avoiding the highway like sort of tenfold. They would cross quite a bit more across that valley if the highway wasn't there. And I think that sort of on average is so important with wildlife, because you see these animals that some will cross a bunch, some won't cross at all. So there's all kind of variation of individuals in there that you kind of got to pull out. But, as wildlife managers, you're sort of managing for this average individual. And so that's sort of the average effect that we want to pull out. And I'll kind of show you this. So this is 3 different grizzly bears, some males, some females. And, you can see the one on the west there crosses the highway quite a bit. And then the 2 on the east, they largely avoid the highway. One basically doesn't cross it at all, goes right up to it. The orange one is basically living right along it and has tons of opportunity to cross, so basically only crosses a few times. So still crosses, but compared to what you'd expect if the highway wasn't there, there's quite a bit of avoidance. And this is kind of part of what the project's meant to do, is help these animals get across. Some very early results. This will definitely change, so don't make any million-dollar decisions on this, but this is just kind of an early look at what we're trying to do, and we can basically model or predict where animals would cross. We only have 8 grizzly bears crossed here. I have or 8 grizzly bears collared here. I have quite a bit more on the BC side that we can use, but this is a sample of the population, but not all of them for sure. And so we can use models to kind of infer if there is a grizzly bear in every corner of this landscape, which some ranchers and hunters might attest to. It sometimes feels like that. This is where we would predict they would cross, and it's sort of almost as you'd expect. They avoid those kind of urban areas. They avoid the crow's nest communities, and they're crossing kind of in the lakes area, right around Burmis, and then 22. And there's kind of a traffic volume piece here too, and that some of those north and south highways have a lot less traffic. And we always want to make sure our models look like reality, and so these green dots are all the actual crossings that we've documented so far. And so you kind of see they're lining up pretty good, so it seems like we're getting somewhere towards reality. And we'll do this for the elk and the mule deer as well. Just before I wrap up here, just a kind of quick primer on that before and after comparison that we'll eventually do in Alberta, but just using the BC side as an example. So what's in yellow is complete. Those are the complete underpasses in BC, and the stretch in number 1 and 2 there is actually fenced. And so we have some structures that are fenced and are retrofitted in Alberta and have been for a few years, or sorry, in BC and have been for a few years. And we see all kinds of pretty cool animals crossing. Basically, every animal that we have in the area, every large mammal has crossed these structures already. Grizzly bears, bighorn sheep, moose, deer, black bears. And I'll just give you a quick insight into that, what that monitoring looks like. So Maria discussed those control and treatment cameras. So the control cameras are off the highway. They're kind of telling us how many animals and what kind are generally around these structures. And then the treatment are under the underpasses. And each one of these is one of the structures, a bridge, and there's a pre-fencing and a post-fencing period. And so if I just kind of direct your eye to the carbon bridge on the left, one you'll see is that the control and treatment are pretty low. There's not that much crossing in general. And then it got fenced, and there's more animals using it than there were, but generally it's not a great structure. And we knew this before. It was what was there, and we retrofitted it and made it a bit better, but it was always kind of a low clearance structure. But the other two are pretty big open span bridges that we were able to make a little more appealing and are just generally seem comfortable for wildlife to pass. And you can kind of see these pretty major jumps in use by wildlife post fencing. And so that's that orange line. You kind of see them doubling or 2.5-fold, and that loop overhead on the far right there. You can see we're passing some around, say, 25 animals a month before the fencing, and now kind of almost up to 60. And we expect that might actually keep going up as they get more and more comfortable. So this is what we want to see, is that it's working, it's passing more animals once it's fenced, because obviously they're getting constrained into here, and we can monitor and make sure that things are working as expected. And that's it. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Wow, that was great, Maria and Clayton. Thank you so much. Just while Emily's preparing, if you can put your questions in the chat, and Emily will read those out. I just quickly, I forgot to mention that the 2 partners that I didn't mention at the beginning that are involved in broader Reconnecting the Rockies umbrella. So the Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative is involved in this project as well, and is working on a corridor governance piece where they're looking at case studies across Canada on how you actually govern corridors, ecological corridors. And then Dr. Adam Ford from UBC is working with Miistakis on some of the integration of ecological networks into municipal planning. So